And Ian Trottier here for a discussion of truth. Coming at you on July 8th. What a world we're living in right now, and incredible country and things happening in the country today. We are shifting gears to a panel discussion with JP Linstroth, Brian Knowles, and a few others that are joining. Let's quickly go in, access, and join discussion here. 1 second here. Standing by. You can again patron the go-to page. Excuse me. Go-to page. The website. My website, iantrottier.com. Let's see if this works here. Let me call in number here. iantrottier.com. Let's see here. I'm attempting to access the call-in number for this this thread that I've set up. 1 second here. I'm not hearing.
Welcome and thank you. Using freeconferencecall.com.
Okay, freeconferencecall.com. I'm not promoting them.
Please enter your access code followed by the pound or hash sign. If you are the host, press star now. Otherwise, please enter your PIN followed by the pound or hash.
Okay, thanks for.
If you do not know your PIN, please enter pound or hash.
Should I see if this works?
Your input is invalid. You entered 4719110.
Okay, well, let's see here.
Please enter your PIN followed by the pound or hash.
Try this again here.
If you do not know your PIN, please announce yourself.
This is Ian, Discussion of Truth. JP.
Ian.
Fantastic, great. So I'm glad this worked. Brian, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Fantastic, great to have you back. My slip in organization, whereas I didn't even think to set up the conference call, and I'm not sure how we thread the three of us together last time, but as I'm reflecting, I thought that perhaps I had this issue last time. So anyway, moving forward, we can simply use this data to form a panel. Now, JP, is Hamdesa with us?
I don't hear him, so I don't know if he's got the message yet. What do you want us to? Do you want me to try to call him? I mean, I can't call him because my phone doesn't allow me to do multiple things. But I have his number. I have his phone number, and I also have Akbar Watson's phone number.
Oh, you do? Fantastic. Okay.
I think it's the Pyramid Books number, so I don't. Brian might have his phone number. I'm not sure if it's any different, but.
Yeah, that's the same thing. Pyramid Book.
So I have just sent. I have just sent Akbar an email with those login credentials, but if you want to take a moment and do that, JP, send to or I can send this. Yep.
The information.
Yeah, just send him the. Yep. And I can do that. Yeah, I can do that as well.
I guess Akbar as well, and I'll. Okay. Let me just.
And Brian, I apologize.
No problem. No problem.
Okay.
I'm here just answering emails, man. When you guys figure it out, I'm good.
All right, good.
Okay.
I got so many of them, so.
That's fine. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, I did send that, so I'm gonna try again. I mean,
yeah,
Hamdesa is a little bit elderly, so he's not.
Not perhaps technically familiar with some of these things.
See. Please call it to.
Now, I've also just sent that to him, JP.
All right, I'll try again. I mean, he emailed me and said, well, it's, 11 Central, what's going on? So I did get an email from him. I have not heard from
Mr. Watson. Now, Brian, are you familiar with Gerald Horn?
No.
Okay, he'll be joining the program.
I know Akbar real well, but yeah.
Gerald is actually a separate. Go ahead, JP. You have something?
No, go ahead.
Gerald is a guest that'll be joining me in a couple of weeks. He's written some fascinating books. He's African American. He's studied at Columbia, Princeton. He's got a JD from Cal Berkeley. He teaches currently at the University of Houston. But go ahead, JP. You got something?
No, I'm just trying to text Akbar though.
Okay. And this is my oversight again. I didn't occur to me that we need some type of a nuclei to all connect here. And so I think that
will you be cutting out like this part? Like, are you gonna be like? You gonna edit like this part like we're talking now?
I never edit anything. So
okay.
We're live on my various outlets, and I simply never edit. I'm happy to send you the file, should you like to edit. But I never. That's always something I've.
No.
That's always something I've.
Is this part live right now?
It's live. It's live on my various outlets. So we are live and we're recording, and that's just my pledge, my personal pledge to my listeners and to the people that follow what I'm doing. That I never edit anything, and I don't, and I try to keep my language clean in the sense of non-use of profanities, and I slipped in doing this for about 4 years, coming up on 4 years now. I've been doing this, and in all the time that I've done this, I've always kept my language very clean because I want kids and people of all ages to listen to this, and I want it to be a family type environment, if you will. And about 7 weeks ago, I used a profane word. So, but other than that, my pledge is always. Akbar's with us.
I don't think I have his correct
contact info.
I don't have his cell phone. Did you ever get his cell phone, Ian? I'm not
sure. I never got that from him. I never got that from Akbar.
All right. I didn't hear back when I emailed him about the change of the time, so maybe he won't be joining us. But I did hear from Hamdesa, so I don't. Let me see.
And Brian, of course, for listeners, this is your
Hamdesa's
second.
in Canada, so he's in Canada, so I don't know if it's going to be different for
Correct.
the dial-in for him.
Right.
Would it be different?
Well, he would just have to use the country code, which is 01. Sounds like somebody's joined us.
See if he's joined us.
Hello, this is Hamdesa Tuso.
Excellent. Hamdesa, hello. This is Ian Trottier. Welcome to Discussions of Truth.
I can't hear you very well. Can you speak a little louder?
Hamdesa, this is Ian Trottier. Welcome to Discussions of Truth. You're joined by J.P. Linstroth and Mr. Brian Knowles.
Hey, Hamdesa.
Hi, John.
Hey, how you doing, man?
How are you doing, Hamdesa?
Doing fine.
Great. Well, Brian, I don't think that, Ian, I don't think that Akbar is going to join us because I haven't heard back from him via email. So I think it'll be just, all of us today, Brian, Hamdesa, and you, Ian.
Well, that's just fine. And Mr. Watson has our connection. Should he have the time and get that, and he can join us during the duration of this. We know that Brian's got a flight to catch, so we're going to give him plenty of time. We're going to conclude. We're allotting a 2-hour segment here, but we will be giving Brian time. We'll be concluding to give Brian time to join that flight. A background quickly for listeners. This is the first time Dr. Hamdesa Tuso, who was born and raised in Oromia in the Ethiopian Empire. Hamdesa, I'm going to mention a word for you. I speak one word of Ethiopian, and I want to see if you recognize this word, Buna. Do you hear that, Hamdesa?
Yeah.
Do you understand the word Buna?
What is this?
Buna, the word Buna.
I don't understand the word Zona, no.
You don't? Okay. So I've had Ethiopian friends and they've taught me this word. My understanding, of course, we're talking about the racial climate in the world and certainly in the United States, but totally outside of that, my understanding is that Buna grows in the province of Kaffa in Ethiopia, and that is where the trade name cafe, the English word coffee, comes from. It comes from Ethiopia, from the province of Kaffa, and the product is Buna.
I understand about coffee from Kaffa, but I don't understand that particular word. Sorry.
The Buna. Okay. All right. Well, that's fine. Hamdesa, take a moment and please introduce yourself to listeners. You're currently in Canada. Is that correct?
Yes, I live in Canada. I'm by myself. I'm a single person. Never married. I have a son who lives in Texas. He's an elementary school teacher. I live here by myself. I teach at University of Manitoba. So I'm here in Canada now.
Fantastic. And what is it, the subjects that you teach, sir?
I teach, my area of specialization is peace and conflict studies. My courses here are culture and conflict, terrorism, international human rights, and indigenous form of peacemaking. Those are the 4 courses I teach. I research in those areas. I recently co-edited a book with a colleague on the subject of indigenous form of peacemaking.
Fantastic. So incredibly pertinent subjects to our time at the moment. And JP, this is a colleague of yours as well. Is that correct, JP?
Yes, I've known Dr. Tuso for 16 years now, and he's a dear, dear friend. I knew Dr. Tuso when he was a professor at Nova Southeastern University, and I was professor there as well. And we both taught for the Department of Conflict Analysis and Resolution there.
And is Brian familiar with Hamdesa?
Sorry, can you say again?
I don't think Brian has met Hamdesa, but I brought Hamdesa along to have a different perspective on the issues that we would discuss today. Brian knows Akbar, but as we mentioned earlier, that Akbar is not able to join us.
Okay, so right. So for listeners to understand, JP Linstroth and most listeners are familiar with your work, JP. You have really spearheaded the organization of this panel discussion. It was a commonly felt desire amongst the three of us as we spoke, that being JP, myself, and Brian, that we have a continued discussion on this. Certainly, the climate, to use that word again, in the U.S. anyway, and certainly internationally, has gotten more severe, has heated up since we last spoke. So, of course, not knowing the future, it's always curious to kind of predict what direction things may be going. But that is the basis upon why we are having this discussion again. Now, Dr. Tuso is joining us, and that is per outreach from JP, Dr. Linstroth, and we are minus for listeners to understand. We have also invited an African American bookstore owner based, my understanding, there in Florida, to join us. At the moment, he is not joining us. So, and then also, I want to mention Sister Peace because unfortunately the schedule didn't mesh. But JP's efforts also drew in an invitation for Sister Peace, who is an African American woman that has converted to Buddhism, and so brings that view of peace and spiritual study to, again, I'll apply conflict resolution, because certainly all of us listening, all of us here participating, the most important thing is peace and equality for all. So, Brian, why don't you take a moment and update us on where you're at, what you're doing, and what has transpired. Why don't you take a moment and introduce yourself again for listeners, and tell us what's currently going on with you.
All right, absolutely. Thank you again, Ian, for inviting me. Thank you, John, for the opportunity to be here. Again, my name is Brian Knowles. I'm the current manager in the school district of Palm Beach County in the Office of African American, Latino, Holocaust, and Gender Studies. And pretty much what my team is responsible for here in our local school district is managing the curriculum for all those subject areas that I mentioned within my extensive title, and also providing support to our teachers and our district personnel around the most adequate strategies to meet the needs and address the needs of our diverse student population. In regards to what we're doing here in Palm Beach County and how things are changing, first of all, we're living in a real different climate right now, as far as one of the things that you said, Ian, is that things are heating up. So conversations around race and structural racism is definitely in the forefront of education, making sure that we provide equitable learning environments and that we provide just overall equity itself for our students and also our employees here in Palm Beach County. So as we do our work, I think, and the best way that I can answer this is that our work is becoming more critical and more pertinent now. We've existed within the school district of Palm Beach County for around 26 years. And we've kind of been on the margins of the peripheral of a lot of the business throughout our local school district. But now we're kind of becoming more centered into the things that are taking place, to making sure that our students are having a learning experience that brings in the history and culture and the perspectives of all of our students, so we can combat and eradicate some of the the racism that we're dealing with as far as in attitudes, I'm going to say, because racism is much bigger than just an attitude of individual interaction. Racism is something that's structured, it's something that's systemic, and it's something that's institutionalized, and it's definitely institutionalized and entrenched within our system of education. But now we're starting to address that. We're starting to have those uncomfortable conversations, or those conversations that cause a cognitive dissonance that we know. And now people are kind of taking in our work and wanting to apply and implement some of the things that we're doing.
That's great. What is Brian? What is one of those things that you're finding effective, if anything is effective? Is anything being effective as far as implementation to avoid that cognitive dissonance? What is something that's happening right now that you're finding effective in that dialogue?
What I would find more effective as far as to address some of that cognitive dissonance is that people are asking for resources, and they're looking at ways to first of all to evaluate biases. People are starting to look at themselves, and we find it effective that now people, I always say you don't know what you don't know. And sometimes we're blinded by our own ignorance and not understanding the things that we're doing and the things that we're saying that can be offensive or hurtful and harmful, or those things that perpetuate racism. But what I find effective now is that people are willing to have those conversations, and people are willing to start to evaluate and examine some of those implicit and explicit biases that we all have, and reaching out to us to identify resources and have those conversations in our workplace.
Excellent. JP, I'd like to incorporate Hamdesa. You knowing Hamdesa better, I want you to run with that, JP, and somehow incorporate Hamdesa into this. Hamdesa, can you hear it? Can you hear me fine?
I just got cut out from the last bit because I just had to call right back in there, Ian. So I did catch the first part of what Brian said, and by the way, I'm very grateful to you, Ian, for putting this together for today. Wanted to talk a little bit about intersectionality and anti-racism, because I think the last time that we had the show with Brian Knowles that we talked a little bit of more of the antiquated ideas about racism. And I think that what Angela Davis, who's a African-American activist, has been an activist since the 1960s, talked about intersectionality, meaning that not only should we discuss exclusion and structural violence, but also, how other minorities are excluded as well, whether we're talking about the LGBTQ community or, whether or not we're talking about women's rights as well. And I think to broaden the discussion to the idea of intersectionality and anti-racism. But if you could recap what Brian said, then I could maybe bring that in. I know that Hamdesa is more of an expert on Frantz Fanon, who was a leading thinker, psychiatrist, and nationalist in Africa when African nation states were breaking away from colonial powers such as Great Britain and France.
Right. So Brian, do you want to insert again? Look, what Brian's doing here, and certainly in the school district, is instilling measurements to squelch any type of systematic racism that is coming to boil. Brian, take a moment and just again talk about what you're finding effective at this moment as far as implementation. Brian, are you there?
I'm sorry, Ian. I'm sorry. I had my phone on mute as everybody else is talking. My apologies. But I was saying that as far as full implementation, it's kind of too early to assess what is effective because right now we're in the middle of summer, and also we're in the middle of even trying to figure out how we're going to go back to school. and what is transitioning back to a classroom going to look like due to everything with COVID. But I can say so far what's just most effective at this point is that I think for the most part, not everybody's ready to kind of move forward because not everybody sees that there's an issue, for one thing. But what's most effective is those who are ready, who do recognize there is an issue that we have, because I still have conversations with people who think that structural and systemic racism is non-existent. But for those who do see that as an issue are those who are really willing to take action right now. When I say actionable steps, there are people right now that are constantly emailing myself and my team, ready right now to start preparing and planning for more diverse instructional materials, for example. You have some people who are reaching out to trying to figure out ways to facilitate those conversations when teachers are coming by. So right now, as far as in planning process, we find it effective that we have people that are willing to move forward. We have people who are willing to take action. We have people who are being proactive in the planning process right now. But kind of just say overall, to say what's effective, it's kind of too early to accept what we're doing because just the midst of so many other issues outside of just some of the hot topics around racism right now.
Hamdesa, I want to thread you into this, and your expertise is peace and conflict studies from a Canadian perspective. And if I can apply the term, whether it's appropriate or not, correct me. Assuming you're a Canadian citizen, you're African Canadian, perhaps. From a North American Canadian perspective and a neighboring perspective to the United States, what is your view, Hamdesa, of your view and opinion on what the United States is experiencing amongst its people in regard to the strive for social and racial equality? What is your view? What is happening in your view? How do you see this?
First of all, thank you for inviting me. I just want to start by saying that I have lived in 3 colonial states over the last 4 decades. I lived in Australia. That's where I did my undergraduate. When I was there was what is known as Australian white policy. What that meant was that unless you are white, you couldn't settle in Australia. You can go there and study, you can go there and visit, but you are not allowed to stay. That was the policy. And I lived there. As a marginal person, I had to do what I needed to do to survive, to complete my education. Mm-hmm. Then I came to the U.S. I did my master's at Andrews University in Michigan, and then my PhD at Michigan State University. Again, I lived as a marginal person. People like me, who have foreign accent, our mannerisms don't fit into Western model. So you have additional burden, additional problems. So I learned how to maneuver and to survive. Now I have been in Canada since for the last 9 years. I have not studied Canadian history as much, but I know big issues going on right now is the rights of indigenous people. Mm-hmm. Canada is an interesting case. They did not set us through conquest as in the case of the U.S. or Australia. They negotiated. However, once the white community became stabilized, then they introduced what's known as the Indian policy, which actually started discrimination, marginalization. Over the last few decades, the indigenous people have raised their voices, they have struggled, and there was a case where the Catholic Church, in collaboration with the government in the 1940s, recruited about 150,000 children from indigenous population, put into Catholic dormitories, school dormitories. The purpose was to brainwash them so they can forget their identity and make them like white culture. Some of the students were hurt, abused, some ran away. Now, after several decades, the indigenous community had rose up and said, we need this to be settled. So there was a commission over some years to deal with this, and there's a Commission for Peace and Reconciliation in Canada. The report came out 2015 with 93 recommendations. At the time, the Prime Minister was Steve Harper, a conservative. He apologized to the indigenous people, and then when Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister, he promised to work with the recommendations. So there's a very big awareness about issue of discrimination and marginalization. One more point. Dr. Linstroth knows he and I have similar interest. We're interested in intergroup conflict in the modern states. Mm-hmm. Only about 80%, only about 20% of modern states have homogeneous people or population. The rest are multi-ethnic. And however, in the modern states, there is this tendency somewhere where one group emerges as a dominant, discriminate against others who don't have as much power. Mm-hmm. Dr. Linstroth studied the Basque situation in Spain, and I studied the case of a marginalized population in Ethiopia. So this is where the concept of intersectionality applies in a broader sense. And I lived in the U.S. for a long time. You know, after I finished my PhD, I was hired by the university in Northeast. I did very well. I was accepted by the white community, by the international community. But somebody was afraid that I was international student advisor, and somebody was afraid, my supervisor, a female, very nervous, afraid that if students, for some reason, international students strike against the administration, I may be side with them. Mm-hmm. So that's where my generalization revealed itself. That is, all the support I had, all the support I built crumbled because there was somebody on top, white, in power, who said that I was a threat to her. Then all of a sudden, all my walls of protection collapsed. And then I was very lucky. About 20 tenant faculty stood up for me. Then we negotiated. I moved to teach. The university had a very strong program in peace and conflict studies, master's, a PhD. I taught there for 3 years. However, the previous problem followed me. So somebody, the office of the provost, say that I should not stay. So finally, kind of normally for a faculty who is hired, they give 3 years, and then they evaluate, midterm evaluation. In my case, after 1 year of teaching, they evaluated me. Even with that, I passed. and then I have big support from the faculty. But the crisis continued. Finally, I was forced to leave. So that's my experience with racism in the U.S., direct experience. And this happens. Higher education is notorious, and particularly when you go for tenure, you have all kinds of problems. It's a kind of interesting phenomena, and you become vulnerable. People don't trust you. They don't give you the benefit of the doubt. It's very tough. Maybe I spoke too long.
No, that's fine. I think all of us appreciate that and appreciate what you've overcome in your struggles. JP, I want to thread you in here, but I'm going to go back to Brian. And of course, Hamdesa, you've brought up indigenous peoples, and you brought up living in other colonial, being Australia, and we're dealing with a lot of different variables, and certainly in the United States right now, there's professional teams that carry symbols or names that resemble Native American peoples, and that's another issue outside of the African American community. There's the Native American community, and I think there was a call by the local Sioux tribe or organization of tribes in South Dakota to have the faces of Mount Rushmore removed. So this is an ongoing issue, and it's obviously not isolated to the African American community, as you've mentioned, JP. It's also other.
And Ian, I'd like to talk about the Native American issue after you bring in Brian. So you just let me know when you want to do that. So.
Okay, and you can probably go in there right now, because what I wanted to do is I wanted to basically go off of the systematic racism, but I think that's going to apply more directly to the African American struggle at the moment, and certainly it doesn't emit the Native American struggle, but without having someone that is representing that community with us. It wouldn't be directly pertinent to receiving that opinion, because I think Brian has brought up a very pertinent and valid point, in that there are folks that are simply denying that systematic racism exists. It sounds like Brian can bring in some examples, but if you're compounding the basic colonial existence that we're living in now, the United States is a little bit different than, say, Australia or Canada, in that it did receive its complete independence from the British Crown and monarchy in any way. So it has struggled throughout its existence. Jim Crow laws and Frederick Douglass, Rosa Parks. It has struggled, and it has also achieved great strides in creating a more equal playing field, and again, isolating to the African American community. So, Brian, if you have a few words to say on that systematic racism, and then JP, yes, do thread in your remarks regarding Native Americans. Brian.
Yeah, and just, when it comes to systematic racism, we're talking about systems. We're talking about very structured forms of racism, just like you say, from slavery to, de jure segregation, which is Jim Crow, the criminal justice system, through housing, through eugenics, through various government-sponsored, forms and structures and institutions that completely debase and marginalize, in this space that I'm speaking of is people of African descent that set up a lot of privilege and wealth and a lot of benefit and rights to some white people, of most white people in some cases. And just unfortunately, there are still people today, just like you say, that believe that this doesn't exist, that this is a non-existent thing, that structural racism is not real, because we may not have explicit laws on the book. Like, for example, during Jim Crow, there was explicit laws that forbid, black and white children from going to school together. And some states, miscegenation laws would say that black and white people can't marry each other. But we're still reeling from the effects, even though we don't have it in that book. I'm thinking, I've seen that structured racism is just only taking new form and shape. When it comes to housing, when it comes to certain policies and practices and procedures and education. Look at what we're seeing in policing and criminal justice, and even some of the laws that we have in both in criminal justice and some of the inequitable policies that we have even in some of our drug laws that we do have, and we're still reeling from the effects of all that stuff, because I just listed a whole line of institutional and structural systems of racism and how we are still dealing with those effects, that it still impacts us, that we have far-reaching implications of that. We look at housing, for example, and how, for years, banks and financial institutions would make loans to African Americans. Or even when you look at, for example, some of the inequities in the GI Bill, you had all these black and white soldiers coming in for defending our country that come home, and you give GI Bills to basically up to the states of what they can do. And you've got some Jim Crow states where there was racism explicitly spelled out, that it wasn't distributed to African Americans, which set up a lot of generational cycles of non-wealth for black people. Then you have cycles of wealth that were created for white people, and education and access and resources. So those are just some examples of that. But just unfortunately, there are still people who think that, solely based on hard work and choices, that people can succeed and overcome those obstacles, which I completely disagree with it. Hard work and choices are some things that can kind of navigate through obstacles, but the existence of obstacles is still there.
Very well said. JP.
Yeah, I just want to say, thank you again to Brian and Hamdesa for participating, and Ian for you having the show. And one of the things I want to bring out is that as a white person in the United States, the idea that understanding racism is also understanding yourself, your own selfhood within the society. And it's constant education, it's constant realization that to understand, the structural violence that's happening in the U.S., not only do you have to understand it from a historical perspective, and an anthropological perspective and a linguistic perspective, but it's also a constant check on the self. And one of the things I brought out in one of my articles I wrote, my first realization of how bad racism in the U.S. was when I was privileged to meet an African-American gentleman who was a deacon of a Black Baptist church, who was a veteran Tuskegee Airman who was college educated at Florida A&M University in Tallahassee, Florida. And he told me his life story, and I was just a really young kid, was a graduate student at Florida State. And I was very privileged to talk to this gentleman, that the only job he was able to get in his whole life was as a janitor. And you have stories like this, but you also have stories of everyday kind of trauma that children face in our society. And one of the books that I would like to bring up is Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. And, and understanding this notion of white privilege is understanding that, we're inundated with it. We're not even realize it, whether it's Disney movies, whether it's music videos, whether it's sports heroes, whether it's Chinese food, whether it's Aunt Jemima syrup or Uncle Ben's rice, the Taco Bell Chihuahua, the Columbus Day, Apu from The Simpsons, and the donkey from Shrek. And then one of the statistics that she brings out, and this is part because the Trump administration hasn't really hired many minorities either, but also in part how our society is structured. Between 2016 and 2017, the 10 richest Americans are 100% white. U.S. Congress, 90% white. U.S. governors, 96% white. Top military advisors, this is current, 100% white. President and vice president, 100% white. U.S. House Freedom Caucus, 99% white. Teachers, 82% white. Full-time college professors, 84% white. People who decide which news is covered, 85% white. People who decide which TV shows we see, 93% white. People who decide which music is produced, 95% white. Owners of men's professional football teams, 97% white. I mean, if you just look at the stark statistics, you begin to see the structures in society that are the cause of this. And what I think, the discussion, and I'm sure, I don't want to speak for Brian, but I mean, this notion of talking about anti-racism, right? Not just racism, but anti-racism, to get in the framework of understanding what white privilege means and what the sociological construct means. And in relation to a country that I was able, and I had a Fulbright to study in Brazil, their constructions of race and ethnicity are completely different than our own. They have constructions of terminology that we don't even use in American society, like caboclo, which is European mixed with Indian, or they've had to create a whole racial category called pardo, meaning brown, for people that don't identify with any particular grouping. And, racism exists within societies all over the world. And one of the other things that Hamdesa touched on was that the idea of Native American boarding schools. This occurred in the United States since 1887. And the idea, you have this colonel, his name was Colonel Pratt. He was Captain Richard H. Pratt, who was in charge for a time of Native American education. And there was a saying, kill the Indian, save the man. So they have a total racist policies against indigenous people. And as you know, I wrote an article about why Native Americans support the recent Black Lives Matter movement and what they view, how they view it, at least from what I understand from their perspective.
This is a question for Brian. Brian, from your perspective, what makes the difference between white America and Black America, and do you feel that white America feels that they should be set on a pedestal or be looked at differently, or should be? Do you feel that white America has a more arrogance? In the sense of, do you feel that they are superior? That they feel they are superior? Is that a perception that you receive?
Generally speaking, yes, that's a perception I perceive, and I think a lot of it is done unconscious. And I don't think in some cases, some white supremacists are going to openly say I am superior, but in some cases, I think sometimes it's implicit because of what we've been taught and what we've learned in school. When you look at what we call norms in American society, those norms are Western European norms, cultural norms, social norms. When you talk about what our kids are taught, any kid in the classroom, and I go back to this, and I'll give you an example of an exercise that I did with a group of students a while back. In that exercise that I did, we did something where we had a matching game with some middle school kids, and they were doing matching game for inventors. And so what we did is we purposely put in that matching game, we put a group of white inventors, your Thomas Edison, your Alexander Graham Bell, etc., that almost any kid in a school district would know. And what they had to find the invention and find out and look at the invention and look at the person who invented it and match it up. And with ease, every single student did it with ease, right? And it was very simple. But when we switched it up and we put Black inventors on the table for those students, it was difficult for them, right? Mm-hmm. And that's simply because of what they've been taught and what's been included within their education. And the funny thing is, these are middle school kids. And one of the kids even took it a step further. And she said, the reason why this is hard because this is not what we're taught. We're not taught that Black people have made significant contributions to society and history. Then on top of that, she said this will be even more difficult if we did inventors from who are Asian, inventors who are women, inventors that are from different cultures. So a lot of that comes from, first of all, what is prescribed and what's defined as normal in our society, in addition to the conditioning of what happens in our schools, or what are we taught? Whose history are we taught? Are we taught from a Eurocentric perspective, or we're taught from a perspective that is balanced, that includes the history, the experiences, the culture, and the contributions of all people?
Yeah, that's incredibly well said, Brian. Hamdesa, how do you insert more humility into the curriculum, and not just curriculum, and not just to draw in from, like Brian had just said, hey, this is the narrative that they've been taught. They've been taught, and it's certainly, to piggyback off of where you're coming from, these colonial powers, they've been taught that perspective. But certainly rewriting some of that curriculum is in order. And the United States right now is facing, and certainly de Blasio in New York, he's just cut a massive amount of funding from the police department. But we saw it firsthand in Minneapolis, where there was something very, very bad going on in that particular police department. And that parallels Brian's comment about systematic racism. So I'm assuming, Brian, that the people that would deny that there is systematic racism were of white ancestry. I would make that assumption. You can correct me, of course. But how do you, Hamdesa, having lived around the world, having been born from an element of the Ethiopian Empire, having African roots herself, how do you insert more humility? And again, not just in curriculum and academics, but in society. In your opinion, how do we do that?
Thank you. You know, racism, meaning discrimination people, black color, it started in Africa itself through colonization, and then taking people and then put them on ship as slaves. And so the history goes back to the continent of Africa. With respect to the issue of humility, you know, racism is about power. And how do we deal with the issue of power? And there are now, I'm not in the U.S., but I follow, at the present time, I follow the news. I have people there, relatives, colleagues. This is a big moment, which is people, white folks are marching with blacks against police brutality, against systemic racism. This is a new moment. So I cannot speak for white folks. I can only speak for my own experience. I think this is on a journey all of us have to work together. I think, in my opinion, we should welcome those of us of color, people of color, the word the color, but we need to accept the humility, the generosity, and help them to work with us. And so this is a new opportunity, new challenges. I also want to emphasize again, racism is about power. Discrimination is about power. But this is a universal phenomenon around the world. John mentioned about his experience in Brazil. In Latin America, in many states such as Guatemala, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, the indigenous people are the majority, but they don't have as much power. So we have a big issue to work with. And as somebody who came from outside, I also want to emphasize global perspective. And I think our brothers and sisters of African Americans, and they have every right to complain. They have every right to demand more rights. They have every right for the white folks to recognize what they have done through slavery, through discrimination. But in the end, I think the issue is humility for all of us, not vengeance, not hateful. Try to work together. So those are my comments.
Yeah, the famous quote. I think it's Patrick Henry, but the phrase basically is "United we stand, divided we fall." So it's very apparent that the more cohesive we work together and come together and unite, the stronger we are. That's just the fact of it. But go ahead, JP.
Ian, Brian has to leave. Do you mind if he says a couple words before leaving? Because I know you have to take an Uber to the airport. So do you mind if he says a couple words?
No, not at all. Not at all.
To sum up what he wanted to say.
Brian, are you there?
Brian, are you still there? All right. He texted me, so he might have already left.
That's fine.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Ian.
That's all right. We can pick up again with Hamdesa. He was. Brian, are you there? Okay. So for listeners to understand, Brian was catching a flight, and I thought he was at the airport. JP, I didn't realize he was having to get himself to the airport and get on that flight. So I know his time is crunched. Okay, so Brian was bringing a real interesting angle to the discussion, and I think that leaving off of where we left, or continuing from where we left with Brian, in that he was bringing to surface, hey, these studies, inventions, let's categorize them amongst white people and then portray them amongst the black people. And in our last episode with Brian, he had brought up some real great examples of contributions African Americans have made to the progress of humanity, if you will. And so from there, of course,
just to thread in with both what Hamdesa was saying and what Brian was saying, and I think from my perspective, and again, I don't want to privilege my own perspective, or as I'd like to think of myself as a public intellectual, somebody who, the more education people have, it's a constant process.
Yeah.
The idea of colonialism, which Hamdesa brought up, is all of these ideas really go back to colonialism, right? And the idea that exclusivity. Rudyard Kipling wrote an unfortunate poem called "The White Man's Privilege," "The White Man's Burden," which really encapsulates this notion that a very patriarchal view of indigenous people, a very patriarchal view of people of color, and so we have to be conscious that this colonial mentality is still with us.
Interesting. Yeah.
Brian just said he's here and wants to sum up what he was saying, so he's going to be able to talk a little bit about before he gets to Zuber.
Excellent.
So that I'll leave it to Brian here.
Hey, John. Thank you again. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, John. Thank you for bringing me here. Just like I say, just for the invitation, I'm more than willing to come back whenever you need me. And just to kind of just wrap up exactly what we're talking about here, and just, you know, when it comes to just racism, just understanding that racism is something that definitely, you know, it's bigger than attitude, and it's something, you know, where racism comes power. Racism comes privilege, and with racism, it also has to be systems that, when conditioned and indoctrinated. So we have to, you know, working in education, I'm going to say the biggest way to combat this is through education, through a proper education, not the Eurocentric education that we have traditionally, not here only in America, but throughout this world. But present an education that shows the experiences, the culture, the perspectives, the viewpoints of all people throughout history, and understanding that our great society and the world that we live in has come into existence through the expertise, knowledge, and the contributions of all groups of people. So just making sure that our children can see each other, see themselves in a positive light. You know, as a Black child coming through an educational system, that I can see myself in a way that I can tap into the innate power that I have. In addition to that same white student who sits next to me can understand that we're equals, that neither one of us are superior or inferior to each other.
Beautifully said. And frankly, and I think I echoed this the last time the three of us had spoken, it really appalls me that this country is facing this in 2020. It just completely blows my mind that this is something that's happening. But you know what? These statues and these other monuments and things of that nature that are being removed and changed, from my perspective, I never even considered that they still stand and even make a difference. So I think some of these things that are being addressed nationally are very pertinent. But the fact that we're having this is very appalling to me at this time. Brian, thank you for joining, and you are always welcome back onto the program. Keep up the good work there in your school district there in Palm Beach County.
Thank you, my brother. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. Take care. Everybody have a good one. Peace.
You too. Take care.
So, you know, JP, this is exactly right, and I think, you know, Hamdesa, this is what you were getting at as well, and certainly is what I had suggested. Is, you know, how do we insert the humility? So inserting that humility is also kind of saying, hey, white student, Black student, but as you're alluding to, JP, and as you spent much of your career studying in Brazil and some of these indigenous peoples around the globe, and it's certainly not isolated to Brazil and the United States, like Hamdesa was saying, in Canada, we've got a challenge in front of us globally for all of us to understand that, hey, we are all human beings, we are all created equal, and we can all contribute in a very special way, and it has nothing to do with any type of institutionalized education to identify who someone else thinks we may be. Some comments on that, JP.
So, I mean, you know, it's hard to sum up everything, but these issues are so complex. So, the one strand, and this is where Hamdesa ties in with Brian, is that we have to understand racism is institutionalized and structural violence is institutionalized. And that means every part of our society, and what I'm talking about in the United States and even Canada, have been culturally and socially inundated by whiteness and this is why it's so hard for white people to accept that, you know, when you say that, well, that's racist, or you bring it up, you know, the automatic position is it's a defensive one. I'm not racist, right? But if you look at just the symbols, and there's a Jim Crow museum in Ohio, which I showed to my students, is very instructive about how objects themselves, how everyday objects, like if we just talked about now these companies are changing, like the Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's And the reason why that those symbols exist is because this familiarity with African Americans being caretakers of white children during slavery. And I want to bring up another icon in American life, Toni Morrison, who brought some of these images to the fore. She was a brilliant woman who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, one of our great American writers. And I don't want to insert African American because she's a great American writer. But, if we look at the symbols of Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben Rice, the idea that you're familiarizing African Americans as part of the family when they're really not, right? So those are symbols that people are not even aware of. And there's this whole fear and people within my own family in that, like, that so-called Antifa are going to take away white Jesus and destroy white churches and things like that. And these are unfounded fears. And so people are, the only way that to address inequalities and racism as such is through education, as Brian was saying. Hamdesa has a very interesting perspective on being an Oromo person within Ethiopia, and his notion and how colonialism has affected him, as he mentioned, by living not only in the United States but also Canada and Australia, and being confronted by white society. I mean, Muhammad Ali, when he was smaller, he brought this up in an interview. He asked his mother, "Why is everything white? Why is everything white? Why is Tarzan white, who's able to talk to the animals, who is in Africa, and the African people who live with these animals for thousands of years aren't able to talk to the animals?" Doesn't make any sense. The whiteness doesn't make sense. The inundation of this white supremacy doesn't make sense because people are not able to analyze it, are not able to step back and say, "Wait a minute, why have the genocide of Native Americans not been taught in school? Why was I never taught this? Why was I never taught about the contributions of African American inventors in the United States? Why was I never taught that Crispus Attucks, the African American person, was the first person killed in the American Revolution? Why was I never taught that it was an African American architect who designed Washington, D.C.? So I mean, Hamdesa can speak better than I, and I want to say that from my very limited perspective, my perspective is from an anthropologist who studies indigenous people, especially in relation to racism that indigenous people have experienced in Brazil, and of course, understanding racism in general. Very, very complex subject, but it's a constant education. And if the one thing I would say as far as conflict resolution and dialogue is that if white society can begin to understand that all of us need to be better educated, to be better, have a better perspective, that white privilege is understanding how your own race or your own idea of race, or the construct, the social construct and the cultural construct that you've been living in presupposes a certain perspective.
So here's my question for Hamdesa at the moment, and Hamdesa, you can address anything that you feel is pertinent in regards to what JP had just mentioned. But in your view, Hamdesa, and we were talking about colonialism, how does religion, how does that play into the current climate on race from your view? How does religion play into this?
This is a very interesting topic you are bringing up. Remember, Africans, they were damned, condemned by history, because European historians say that Africa has no history. They were condemned by science, because 19th century scientists say that Africans don't belong to human race. They are much closer to a type of creatures. The religion, and Africa has no religion. And the basic premise, the basic construction, ideology of colonialism started with Christianity. And there were colonial systems before Christianity, before the dominance of European power. However, in the case of colonialism by European powers, it was the idea that the superior religion has to be spread. We are going to civilize these people. That was the way it was constructed. And that's one of the issues that we have to confront. That is, African Americans made tremendous stride in terms of using Christian religion against the oppressor. You know, the African American spiritual songs, like Moses, go tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And so people have utilized religion, Christianity, to overcome the ideology of dominance as white Europeans used to dominate others. So part of our reconstruction, part of our discussions has to be the basic idea of there's only one religion. You know, African religions, Africans in Islam, they are called infidels. In Christianity, they were called pagans. In Judaism, they were called Gentiles. So we have all these burdens, a lot of burdens to work out. So I think John mentioned education also, Brian. Education is, in my opinion, is the only source of reconstructing, understanding these dynamics. And in education, it helps us to think together, to work together. So finally, I want to emphasize something very important, which is, remember, discrimination is not limited only based on color, skin. And those who have power create different form of discrimination, different logic. The caste system in India, on the part of the world, and others. So I study this from a cross-cultural perspective. Issue is about power. It's about the othering. Those people are not like us. In the Middle East, the Kurds face this across the Middle East. John studied the case of the Basque in Spain. And so we have a lot of work to do, but I think education is our most useful tool.
So I'm glad I addressed this and brought this up. And JP, I'd like to get your view on this as well. And if we look at, of course, my view is that the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, some of these legal documents that have preceded the formation of the United States has become some of the most perfect governing documents ever written. This is my view, of course, and I'm not very versed on other civilizations around the globe. But if we take, for instance, the distinction of freedom of religion that I know is not a liberty extended through other countries. If we take that in the United States, but then we're also looking at, okay, well, how has religion shaped? I think for listeners to listen to the points that you've brought up, Hamdesa, Jew versus Gentile, that sort of thing, and the black man from Africa being genetically closest to an ape. I mean, some of this stuff is, in my view, it's quite disgusting, and it should have no tolerance. But then we are fed it, aren't we, through some of these religious practices that we allow into our cultures as at large. So, what are your thoughts on that, JP?
Okay, so Hamdesa is absolutely correct. I mean, what we're talking about is a whole system here, colonialism, where people of indigenous people, whether we're talking about Africa or the Americas or Asia, were not considered people, right? I mean, so when go back to when Columbus encountered, and I say encountered because it's not discovered, he encountered peoples in the so-called New World in the Americas. He landed in what is probably present day the Bahamas, and because they were not European or Christian or what have you, they were non-human.
Right.
And going back to the idea of wild man, going back to the idea of Aristotle and the ancient Greeks, people that did not speak your language were considered other and wild and not civilized, right? This idea of civilization. And one of the people that needs to be brought up, who was the late Edward Said, who was a Palestinian American, who wrote some his very famous book Orientalism, was how the West views the Orient, right? How it pictures it, how it imagines others, and we can even, looking at the rubber boom in South America, when Europeans terrorized and enslaved indigenous peoples into the rubber economy and were more savage than the savages they imagined, which is the total case of Europeans throughout the history of conquest and domination and oppression. That the notion of indigenous peoples are savage, that they're non-human, that they're animalistic, which goes back to genocide. This is how genocide is framed when you create humans into non-human animals. And so the idea that your religion needs to be stamped upon these others, these indigenous others, these non-European others, and that you have a sort of patriarchal duty to do so. Now, let us also examine what Malcolm X also examined, how whiteness is construed. The notion of the plantation owner as the word the man, and the African people working on the plantation were lesser or almost children when you call African men boys. And if you look at the Muddy Waters song, Mannish Boy was a reification of his own manhood in the blues music that needed to be said. I mean, so there's so many layers to this, Ian, of colonialism, how religion was used, Catholicism especially, by the Spaniards, by the Portuguese initially, and then of course the Protestant religions. And if you look at the American boarding school system and the Canadian boarding school system for Native Americans, of killing the Indian, saving the man, the project of colonialism is complex, but wherever colonialism happened, it happened uniquely where it happened. But mostly it happened through Great Britain and France, who had the biggest colonial empires. And another anthropologist who wrote about colonialism's culture, Nicholas Thomas, frames that as well, but there are many others.
What we can look at the motive for colonialism and
Hamdesa says more about this.
And Hamdesa, you've addressed.
Hello.
Oh yeah, sorry. I did what Brian did. I put the phone on mute. I think that we can identify two basic motives for colonialism. Let's say, from my perspective, and one, Hamdesa, you've already addressed, and that's power, and it's this almost man's hunger for, driven by, let's say, greed, perhaps, for power and controlling natural resources. Okay, I mean, certainly we've seen that in formation of these disgusting wars the past certainly 150 years with these wars over power and resources. But another angle I think that we've also hit on here is a driving force for that colonialism, and I think very pertinent to today, because we are products of these various colonial drives already mentioned, mainly, of course, European, whether it be Portuguese, Italian, Spanish, British, French. But many of that also is being driven from religion. So if we're taking 2020 and the year, and obviously we're inserting these indigenous peoples that have been slaughtered, that have been brutally murdered and killed based on the white colonial, whether it be Spanish or British or whatever it may have been, their perspective of who those native peoples were, and or their undesire to accept the imposement of will and European-based governance. And you addressed that as well, JP, in form of Catholicism. What are we looking at today in the U.S.? Does that mean that we need to be, are some of these killings, George Floyd? I mean, we can even go back to Rodney King, right? 25 years ago in L.A. And we've had Trayvon Martin. We've had a number of different. The African American community seems to be speaking out and wanting to put a stop to this in the United States, certainly. What is, again, if we're looking for that insert of humility and possibly rewriting some of this curriculum in our elementary schools, middle and high schools, what is Canada doing, Hamdesa, that perhaps in your view may be more successful rather than what the United States could be doing? What could the United States learn, if anything? What could the United States be learning from what's being done in Canada right now, Hamdesa?
Racism in Canada has been covered up by polite gestures, polite mannerisms. It's a different type of racism, because the Europeans who came to Canada, they did not come as conquerors. They came as merchants. They came as such of goodies. So they negotiated with indigenous people, but as once they established themselves, they created hierarchy And they put indigenous people in particular villages, areas, so-called Indian reservations. So I don't know if anything that people can learn from Canada, because things are deep. But the history is different, because in the U.S., they came through conquest and destroyed the society of indigenous people. They bought slaves. Slavery became a source of power. In part, the American Civil War was about whether to continue slavery or to abandon. In the southern states, deeply interested or source of economy, source of pride. It's kind of interesting now what's going on in the U.S. is fascinating to me. People like Thomas Jefferson had slaves. He had children from a black woman, but never accepted as his children per se in public manners. Princeton University just took away the name of Woodrow Wilson from its prestigious School of International Relations.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of things are going on in there. But the things in Canada is not as dramatic as in the case of the U.S. But the racism exists, the marginalization exists. One unique problem about indigenous people in Canada is that the population is small, only 4%. In contrast, the population in the U.S., African Americans are, sizable population, and the politicians cannot ignore them anymore. The fact that Joe Biden his campaign for president during the primaries received a lot of support for African Americans, and African Americans are voting now, particularly women, and it's really fascinating. So they are using their power. I'm very fascinated what the mayor of Washington D.C. did when Trump kind of attacked her. She ordered to paint on the street next to the White House Black Lives Matters. So the indigenous people in Canada don't have as much because they don't have enough population. They can vote, they can go to court, but in order to have impact in political system, you need to have a sizable population to which the politicians have to pay attention. Mm-hmm. That does not exist. Racism is silent here. It is hidden, but it's there. It's typically, this is the creation of colonial system. The same culture that produced those who went to the U.S. and South Africa and Australia, the same culture produced those who came to Canada. So it exists. But now there is a lot of dialogue. The academic community is supportive of empower indigenous people. I don't know what U.S. can learn. I think the U.S. has to learn from its own history, the progress it has made, the mistake which have been done. And so I think education is still a very important source.
JP, how do you view what's happening in the United States, and how do we improve this situation?
Well, it's complex because it gets into issues of policing, which is another whole other issue. But there's a recent article that just came out. I just saw it, and the premise of the article was that we've been pulling down statues. This is a National Geographic article. We've been pulling down statues since the U.S. independence, and at the time, during the American Revolution, people were pulling down statues of George III. Now, and I want to get into some of the things that Hamdesa was talking to, but as far as I saw, unfortunately, that a statue of Frederick Douglass was pulled down in Rochester, New York. And I think that there should be a delineation between Confederate statues and Confederate memorabilia that represent and symbolize a system of hate and a system of slavery versus American presidents who are kind of in this gray area. And Hamdesa brought up the notion, brought up the fact that Woodrow Wilson's name was taken off the Woodrow Wilson Institute. And the reason for that was that Woodrow Wilson was a Southerner. He was a former president of Princeton University, former governor of New Jersey, but was a Southerner and definitely had racist implications in the sense that he did not help African-American veterans when they came back from World War I, especially in relation to what happened in Texas and lynching of African-Americans. Many African-American veterans in Texas, he did not intervene. Andrew Jackson was a slaveholder, and Hamdesa brought up Thomas Jefferson being a slaveholder, which his children by his former slave were not recognized in society. George Washington having held slaves, many of the founding fathers having held slaves in that first generation of presidents, with the exception of John Adams. So this idea of power in relation to race is very important. And one of the thinkers, Michel Foucault, is central, I think, in understanding notions of power. In other words, power is knowledge, and how knowledge is related to power, but also how knowledge can be a controlling mechanism, and how structures within society can add to that those notions of control. But certainly, there was a big flaw in American society in relation to if as you know, Ian and Hamdesa, with the Declaration of Independence, that we're all endowed with inalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which was in many regards plagiarized from John Locke, but took the notions from an English philosopher, John Locke. But I think the in dealing and with racism, Hamdesa and Brian were absolutely correct. As an education and re-education, and a willingness to dialogue about education and understanding of this colonial past, that we'll be able to move forward.
Yeah, well said, JP. We've got a lot of different things discussed here, and I think some good substance for listeners to go with as we wind down here. I'd like to give each of you some time to give your closing thoughts on how to best move forward. One of my initial thinking is, slavery is something that the Egyptians evidently had. It's something that has plagued man, if you will, since the formation of certainly ancient Western civilization, and that notion of enslaving another human being, to me, just who I am as a person living right now on the planet, is really appalling. To me, I can't conceptualize that, especially now we have machines doing so much of the work, but of course the technology didn't exist in the 1860s that we have today, or prior to that, and certainly even George Washington. But it's an interesting argument. Where does it initially concept, and why was it tolerated? In that by the time the United States had been developed, it was still pertinent and required a civil war to essentially abolish it. That aside, I just inserting that as a thought. What I find equally disgusting is the fact that our freedom to speech, being in the United States, and our freedom to protest. I personally, JP, you may not know this, but I proposed a protest on public land a number of years ago in Miami, and I was told that the cameras would be forced off. I'd be thrown onto private land. I'd be arrested, charged with a felony, and charged with an act of terrorism. That is the word that I got for suggesting that a protest be staged on public land in Miami. That aside, what I find equally disgusting are these protests, which should be civil. They are not civil. They're turning into looting and rioting and violence. People are losing their lives. That is filth to me, and should not be tolerated. On a separate discussion down the road, perhaps we can get into the defunding police debate, because that is also it's a fact of life. It is a decision that many of these cities are making. But how do we move forward? And I want to get, as we close down, I want to get first Hamdesa. I want to get your thoughts, and then JP, get your thoughts. Basically, I want you to share with listeners how to best move forward in this time. And Hamdesa, you can direct your comments toward Canadian listeners, or simply American, or simply global listeners, however angle you'd like to address that. But please take a moment, Hamdesa, share with us your closing thoughts, and then JP, the time will be yours to close out.
Before I make comments along your suggestion, I just want to also point out something very important about colonialism. When the European colonialists left Africa, left behind its modern states, which had different identity groups. The state power inherited those who were close to Europeans. This created a new form of discrimination, marginalization. That's why you have so many civil wars in Africa. That's very important to remember. Issue of power. So the impact of colonial system is still harms Africa. Interesting. Yeah. With respect to the suggestion or question, how do we go forward? I don't have any particular wisdom on this. The only hope and the only thing that I think I emphasize is that we all should learn from the struggles which are being made. And one of the things that is interesting in the U.S. is that there were white people who were against slavery. There were white people who marched in the South during the 60s for blacks to vote. Now there are white people who are marching with blacks. And we need to learn from those people. We need to embrace those people. Also in Canada, similar things are happening. That is, recently there was a dispute about a particular piece of territory in British Columbia. That is a province near to the Pacific Ocean. And there was a rail line which was crossing the indigenous territories, indigenous people, particularly the so-called traditional elders, opposed the idea. So they wanted to demonstrate, they wanted to prevent the trains to going to running. So there was a lot of, for a long time, several weeks, there's a lot of white people who supported that march. And of course, there were other people in Canadian politicians who said that the Canadian government should take more hard line. Trudeau said, no, we are not going to use violence. We are not going to do anything that will provoke more. We are going to make dialogue. So they made dialogue. And the way the crisis ended was that both parties did not want to claim victory. They silently agreed that no, the train line should be open, let's go forward. And so it's a new way of thinking. It's a new way of making joint journey, working together. And white people have to participate in this. We have to embrace them, those who are willing to. Again, education is a very, very important tool. It's happening in Canada, and it's happening in the U.S. There are people who are willing to come forward and support new vision for cooperation, for respect, for collaboration.
Thank you, Hamdesa. JP.
So the issues that we're talking about today have a very long history and go back at least 500 years with colonialism and its project and the European project, especially for European powers that, took over the world. Great Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, the Dutch. And this idea of otherness and how even in Western European thought, its philosophy and so on, whether we're talking about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the ideal man, a man in nature who is, the ideal person being gentle versus like a Thomas Hobbes, that we're all basically brutes. And we can go back all the way to the ancient Greeks, Aristotle and so on, the wild man. But I think going back to what Hamdesa and Brian were saying, that the fundamental thing we need to do is a project of education, is a project of re-education. It's a project of realizing that what's been called decolonizing our academic system. And by decolonizing, I think what is meant is to change the perspective, not only from a European point of view, but also from understanding, the genocides that happened throughout the world, whether we're talking about the Belgian African colonialism in the Congo, or what the British did in Africa, or the French did what the French did in Africa, and then what Fanon talked about and discussed in his works of overcoming that colonialism. And today what we're talking about are minority positions that want to be recognized and don't want the symbols of racism to be prevalent in society. And especially Confederate monuments or the Confederate flag, and even perhaps those even Catholic priests like Santa and so on who were leading the rounding up of indigenous peoples and so on, and being sensitive to that. However, and what Hamdesa was talking about is understanding too that, during the whole period of slavery, you had the abolitionist movement. You have the white society who wanted to question these systems of power, and how do we incorporate people, white society, to address these issues? And we're talking about Australia, we're talking about Brazil, we're talking about everywhere it exists, every country in the world, France, England, Canada. And this idea of defunding the police, I mean, in my view, there's the backlash that that people want to do away with the police, and if you take a moderate position, it's not the case. It's just that redirecting more funding through education, through community projects, by not allowing for qualified immunity, which the Supreme Court's going to have to decide, by taking a look at these police federations, which is really the labor unions of the police, which have more power for not allowing for accountability. And by taking a hard look at those issues and realizing, yes, police are necessary in society, government is necessary in society. We don't want anarchy, but how can resources be better placed to address issues of drug abuse, to address issues of housing in urban areas, to address socioeconomic inequalities? And one of the interesting issues that I thought was brought up by an African-American academic was that we need truth and reconciliation commissions. We need truth and reconciliation commission that could be a cabinet position for understanding our racist past with African Americans, slavery, Jim Crow, and so on. We need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission too for Native Americans, for understanding the genocide, for understanding the border school system, for understanding that, and also and taking a look at our curriculum. How can we decolonize it? How can we make it less Eurocentric? How can we be better educated as a populace for addressing this? And I think there's a willingness in society to do that now, especially after the George Floyd killing. And I think Hamdesa brought that up quite rightly, saying that there's more of a willingness. And look at the demonstrations; they've been multiracial, multi-ethnic.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a sea change from when if you look at interviews with activists like Cornel West or Angela Davis, that there's a real difference now of a real white society wanting to understand. And it's unfortunate that we didn't have Akbar Watson, who was the owner of bookstore Pyramid Books, who could talk about why now he's had a resurgence of people wanting to buy books on all these issues. And unfortunately, we didn't have Sister Peace, who is an African-American Buddhist nun who has a real interesting perspective on peace and relation to these issues of race and society. But I'm really glad that, and thank you, Ian, for inviting Dr. Tuso and Brian Knowles and myself to talk about these issues.
Absolutely, and I think I don't see this issue going away anytime soon. So I remain open to having this continue and inviting Sister Peace on to the program, and Mr. Watson as a bookstore owner to also join this discussion. I think we brought up some very relevant issues here, and this is an incredibly deep-rooted issue. But what I draw away, and primarily from things that you said, Hamdesa, in that this is deep, and you've just said it, at least 500 years, JP. This is a colonial angled route that is a major challenge, going to be a major challenge globally, but certainly domestically here in the U.S. to uproot. And listeners are certainly contemplating, and they already have certainly their own mind made up in one way or the other on how this current administration is dealing with this. And something you've said, JP, in that minorities, if that's a proper term to be using here, but African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans do not hold a large percentage of membership in that current administration. And frankly, I don't see any. I see very few. So that's another thing that needs to be addressed. And things like Title IX, I know in colleges, and that goes back to the 70s, have helped try to incorporate that type of balance and equality. But we've got a long road to haul here, and certainly I think that reconvening with another panel is something that discussions of truth should be having. So thank you, Dr. Tuso, for joining the program. JP, as always, thank you very much. And you were both cordially. Yes.
Couple of things, Ian. Just sorry, and I just think to educate listeners, and I just thinking, what listeners might want to know. Well, what can I read, or what can I see? And one of the books is called White Fragility: Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, by Robin DiAngelo. Was a New York Times bestseller, and I believe Beacon Press, Boston, and was published 2018. Another well-regarded book is called How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibrahim Kendi, and also a well-regarded book. And again, you can find some of my articles on Counterpunch. Dr. Tuso at the University of Manitoba has written several articles about Ethiopia and also his experience living in exile. And Brian Knowles has his position as the person, the head of African American Studies and Ethnic Studies at the School District of Palm Beach County.
Excellent. Thank you for those contributions, JP. Hamdesa, would you like to direct listeners to a website or a book in particular?
My writings is mostly of indigenous form of peacemaking, and also about ethnic conflict, essentially conflict, identity-based conflict. And I focus on, currently I'm writing a book on working research on a book on ethnic conflict in Ethiopia between 1991 and 1998. I'm working also a second book, the intergroup conflict in Ethiopia since 1940. So, but I read as much as I can, not as well as John. John is terrific. But I try to understand this issue of discrimination from cross-cultural perspective, issue of power, issue of the othering, kind of, you are not like us, therefore you are subhumans. This is kind of a universal phenomena. So I think the dialogue, the discussion in the U.S. with respect to racism should incorporate this cross-cultural perspective. I think it is more useful to do that instead of only focusing on one local phenomena. And thank you for inviting me.
Ian, thank you so much. I just think Hamdesa is being very humble here, because he's one of the lead conflict resolution, peace studies people. He was an editor of the book Creating the Third Force, Indigenous Processes of Peacemaking. He was another editor of the book Critical Issues in Peace and Conflict Studies. He was an editor of the book Gender and Peace Building, and also another edited book, Peace on Earth, The Role of Religion in Peace and Conflict Studies. So Dr. Tuso is one of the leading peace studies scholars, and I certainly, I'm so grateful that he was able to join today. And Ian, thank you so much for having this wonderful discussion today.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, both of you. And I look forward to having you both rejoin the program.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks.
J.P. Linstroth, a common, lack of a better word, a frequent, thank you, a frequent contributor and voice on Discussions of Truth. And if this is the first time you've listened to the program, this was started going on 4 years now in Wynwood, the Wynwood district of Miami, while I was residing in Miami Beach. I have been broadcasting remotely now for a number of months, and the issues certainly increase and augment in severity and in importance. Hamdesa Tuso, born, raised in Oromia in the Ethiopian Empire. We are faced, folks, with, it simply astounds me that this country is going through this type of growth right now. I think it's a very healthy growth without the violence. There's simply no place for that, and that should not be tolerated, period. So it is my hope that as you listen to these words, that you make every contribution you personally can to emit violence in your communities on all levels, but certainly in regards to this protesting. There should be a zero tolerance of any type of violence and any type of provocation, any type of militia being formed from any ethnical identity needs to be squashed. Violence is not the answer, period. And unfortunately, man and woman have not learned that through history. But let us learn, shall we? Here's a unique perspective as I wind this down here. If you are in need of care, urgent, you require the services of another human being, regardless of those services, whatever those services may be. Perhaps you are sick, you're ill, and you need an ailment. Take that in consideration and ask yourself, if it was a life and death situation, does it matter what the other person looks like? Would it matter to you what that other person's skin color would be, or language would be? Would that make any difference? How valuable is your life? And if you think that would matter to you. That would be surprising to me very much. Because I know personally, if I needed a hand, and I needed, in a life or death situation, I needed someone to help me, the last thing on my mind is what that person would look like or talk like. This has been another discussion of truth, folks. United we stand. Divided anyone falls. And that includes your very own family. All right? So, venture forth. And I appreciate you listening. Next week, we have another incredible guest. I will do my best. To reorganize another panel discussion. JP is making incredible contributions to this program. So look for that coming very soon, very shortly. Next week, a former Fox News executive, Ken LaCourte, will be joining us. Until then, folks, have a fabulous day. Do your best to make your community and your country a better place. Until then, be awesome.